There's a point in your life when things that have happened to you just become stories. I don't mean that they are less important or that they didn't happen, but they just turn into that thing that happened once. No matter how much it affected you, it's just a story, even if you were the one who survived. 5 years ago, when we were around 15, my best friend Andy and I decided to go trick or treating one more time. I knew we were probably too old and the adults in the neighborhood would roll their eyes when we showed up. But we figured they'd just give up the candy because kids our age were more likely to mess with their house if they didn't get free chocolate. Andy and I weren't like that at all, but it didn't make us less any likely to remembrance the idea. Free candy is free candy. Being out of age when lazy becomes an art of its own self, Andy and I weren't just only going out to find that getting crappy stuff like butterscotch candies or that sort of stuff you'd see in Grandma's candy dish. Leave that for whatever our parents did. This is the digital age. If you want to know and look, even with the basic social media skills, you can actually get your route mapped out for you in advance. Even 4 years ago, kids were all over Twitter posting pics and putting up hashtags that they were really good candy was. It's probably more Instagram now. We looked for hashtag full size. While it sounded like a good idea at the time, it also led to more than a few pictures of dudes naked below the waist. It wasn't a foolproof way to find the candy, but it worked at least a little bit. We were able to find a neighborhood, not too far from Andy's house, that had 4 different stops with full-size candy bars. We each had 3 different masks. You know, the cheap thin plastic ones, that kind you get held on your head, even by a cheaper and thinner piece of elastic or rubber band. They were actually $1 piece at the local dollar store. And we got more than that back in that chocolate just from those houses. Sure, by the 3rd time the parents got the clue, but what difference did it make? By the time we actually went out, only about an hour had passed until most of the houses were turning off their lights or blowing out the candles in their pumpkins. We actually went out a bit later than the other kids, because we were older and of course, that meant we couldn't be out all the same time as the little kids. Andy was scrolling through Twitter, trying to see if there were any other houses close by that we could hit up, and wasn't having that much luck, and was looking through what had turned out to be a pretty epic haul when he nudged at me with his elbow and held out his phone for me to see. "Hey, there's this one more," he said, with his voice muffled behind his white skeleton mask. I looked at the screen and saw a picture of 3 full-size Snickers bars on a picture with the hashtag full size. Andy N scrolled his thumb across the screen and showed the address. It was about 2 miles away, which we were livid, mean that we lived out in the middle of the nowhere near the edge of the woods. "Dude," I said, "that's way out there. We won't get there before they go to bed." Andy shook his head. "Nah, check it out." He kept scrolling his thumb all the way to the people who had replied to the picture. No one was going out there. Everyone saying it was too far away or too creepy or whatever. Even if they went through the trouble getting the full-size candy bars and barely anyone showed up, they were for sure going to wait up. I bet it's some lonely geezer who just wants people to remember they're alive. I hesitated. I really don't want to go out that far. It was cold out and I watched as the thick clouds of breath came into view from behind Andy's mask. 2 miles? I asked. Andy proceeded to goad me with some sort of more off-color insults but I've ever heard, none of which meant anything to me until he pointed out that no one was going there. When they probably would just give us a bunch of candy without needing to do the mask routine. Finally, I agreed. If nothing else, it would make me a good story. We could always make it even sound better. Maybe we can even live to tweet and see if people can make it go viral. We talked about doing it the entire walk there, on how we can make it seem like we were in the middle of the scary movie. Going up to the house, hashtag creepy. There's some weird music playing inside, hashtag WTF. WTF? That just sort of thing trying to get people to pay attention. Even if they were asleep, we could take some pics or something to make it seem like it was a big deal. What else were we going to do? Except we forgot that most of the day of the time we got there, the house was even further back in the woods than I thought. The start of the driveway seemed about a half a mile from the road to the house, and there was a slight bend with it that you couldn't see the house, beyond a light that was one in front of the windows. We didn't stop at the road for anything that dramatic. We had just been walking that far. I think Dad was just as much as excited ourselves at the idea of the Twitter thing. We were also tired, but we wanted to get the candy and go home to watch scary movies. As long as the driveway it felt like a fast walk. I didn't take my eyes off of the door from that moment. We could see it. There was just one light on the other side of the house. I think it was a garage light and shone out the side window, so you can't actually see the inside of anything. There was a carved pumpkin with a flickering flame on the stoop, but it was actually poorly done. Like a little kid or some old person with a palsy trying to make it. And there was even a lock on the door. I don't mean like a deadlock, but one of those little 5-button things that you use to attach to the doors of houses that were for sale. See, old people, they keep that in there in case they lock themselves out or something, Andy said in a tone that didn't sound all to be sure, but it sounded good enough to me as my arm reached out to press the doorbell. The sound of the ding-dong had barely stopped when the door cracked open. Andy and I stood there, not a single word between us when we stared off of what could only be assumed as the man in the window. He was about average height, a little overweight, but was still wearing that weird mask. It had squinting eyes and a really fat cheeks, as a puckered mouth, as if it was trying to hold its breath. Behind the man was a single exposed red light bulb that backlit him. He just stood there wheezing, with each breath behind the mask, as it slowly turned back and forth looking at each other of us. I'm not sure which one of us spoke first, but eventually we remembered to say trick or treat. The man just stood there for at least another moment, looking back and forth between Andy's skull mask and my fox mask, before turning around and walking deeper into the house. Andy and I looked at each other. Even though I couldn't see his eyes, I imagined they had the same confused, terrified look as mine. When we looked back, I could see the man pick up a box of candy bars. As he slowly turned the door, as his arm hit a railing as he grunted, as the box flew out of his hands, the candy bars spilling onto the ground. Actually, a few slid within a foot of the door. The man grunted and cursed and bent over to pick them up. Andy and I didn't move from where we were on that front step until the man turned around. He was on his hands and knees picking up the candy bars, and Andy nudged me, pointed the candy that just inside the door. I think I shook my head, but I can't remember. A moment of panic overtaking me, just wanted to leave so I could reach outside to the door to grab the candy. The man's back was still turned, and I knew I could just grab the near bar and we could take off running, splitting up if we need to. Why would he chase us? I had no idea, but we were pretty worked up by that point. It all happened in a matter of seconds. My hand touched the smooth, cool wrapper of the candy bar. I felt a vice grip clamp down on my wrist so hard I thought it would break. The man had sprung in place and grabbed me. He had been way closer than I realized. Something about the light and the mask messed within how I can see him. In one smooth motion, he tugged my arm and went flying into the door. But as soon as he pulled me past him, my body falling to the ground like a lump. I lunged at he lunged at Andy. Something flashed in his hands. Andy had turned around to run and suddenly crumpled to the ground. The man stood over him, still breathing insanely loudly, his breath in a cloud in front of his face. I was trying to get up as he slowly turned, and I saw that in his hand was a taser. That's the last thing I remember before waking up again the outside of my house. My body ached and my head was killing me. My face was cold too. I soon realized that I wasn't wearing my mask. I looked around desperately for Andy, but I was all alone. The front of the door to the house was closed. The pumpkin was gone off the front step. The lights were off. I scrambled to find my phone, but That was gone too. I was just about to start running when the panic shifted in me. I realized that Andy might be in the house still. Yeah, he could have run away, but what if he didn't? As quietly as I could, I went around the house, trying to find the darkened windows, but I couldn't see anything. I was too scared to knock on the door. I mean, it wasn't a prank. That son of a bitch used a taser on Andy. When I almost had done complete lap, I thought I saw something moving in the dark. I cupped my eyes to the window and almost passed out as the fat, round mask burst towards the window. Thumping the forehead against the glass, I let out a scream and it just stayed there, staring at me. When it looked down at the side, next to him, I watched as something white lifted into view. It was a skeleton mask. Andy's skeleton mask. And there was something splattered on it. Something ran. I ran. I ran until my legs gave out, and I tumbled against the first house. I had all the lights on. I was gasping, crying, and begging them to call the police. By the time the police got to the house, there was nothing there. No man, no Andy. All they found was a splintered door frame from where the back door had been kicked in. I hadn't even noticed that the dark. If I had, maybe I could have done something instead of running away like a coward. I later learned that the lock was on the door because the house had been foreclosed within a week prior. The Twitter account that Andy and I had found was a week old as well. If we had bothered to look, we would have had the account followed over 1,000 people that had all of the 15 followers. All the tweets and retweets and other legit accounts except for that one picture with the candy bars. It was registered in the name of the kid who went to a nearby middle school. But it was just a lie, just to throw people off, to lure someone in. And it worked. I cried a lot. I cried as I told the strangers of whose house I ran into what happened, begging them to call the police. I cried when I told the cops and my parents of what happened. I cried as I tried to understand why all of it happened, why they let me go, and why he only took Andy. It's been 5 years since Andy disappeared, and there's been nothing, no response. Every year I sit up on Twitter and I look up #full-size, checking everything out, making sure it wasn't a lie or a lure. I've called the police more than a few times thinking I found the guy. But mostly I'm just looking for my friend, so I can stop telling this story and start living my life again. And that life I lost that day, Andy disappeared. All for a full-sized candy bar.